of the fear actually anticipated. Once people look to government to alleviate their fears and make them safe, expectations exceed reality. FEMA originally had a small role, but its current mission is to every natural disaster that befalls us. This mission was exposed as a fraud during last year's hurricanes. Incompetence and corruption are now FEMA's label. This generates anger among those who have to pay the bill and among those who didn't receive the handouts promised to them quickly enough. Generating exaggerated fear to justify and promote attacks on private property is commonplace. It serves to inflame resentment between the producers in society and the so-called victims whose demands grow exponentially. The economic impossibility of this system guarantees that the harder government tries to satisfy the unlimited demands, the worse the problems become. We won't be able to pay the bills forever, and eventually our ability to borrow and print new money must end. This dependency on government will guarantee anger when the money runs out. Today, we're still able to borrow and inflate, but budgets are getting tighter, and people sense serious problems lurking in the future. This fear is legitimate. No easy solution to our fiscal problems is readily apparent, and this ignites anger and apprehension. Disenchantment is directed at the politicians and their false promises, made in order to secure re-election and exert power that so many of them enjoy. It is, however, in foreign affairs that governments have most abused fear to generate support for an agenda that under normal circumstances would have been rejected. For decades, our administrations have targeted one supposed Hitler after another to gain support for military action against a particular country. Today, we have three choices, termed the axis of evil: Iran, Iraq, or North Korea. We recently witnessed how unfounded fear was generated concerning Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction to justify our first ever preemptive war. It is now universally known the fear was based on falsehoods, and yet the war goes on and the death and destruction continues. This is not a new phenomenon. General Douglas MacArthur understood the political use of fear when he made this famous statement. Quote, "Always there has been some terrible evil at home or some monstrous foreign power that was going to gobble us up if we did not blindly rally behind it." We should be ever vigilant when we hear the fearmongers preparing us for the next military conflict our young men and women will be expected to fight. We're being told of the great danger posed by Ahmadinejad in Iran and Kim Jong-il in North Korea. Even Russia and China bashing is in vogue again, and we're still not able to train with or travel to Cuba. A constant enemy is required to expand the state. We're hearing more and more news stories blaming Iran for the bad results in Iraq. Does this mean Iran is next on the hit list? The world is much too dangerous, we're told, and therefore we must be prepared to fight at a moment's notice, regardless of the cost. If the public could not be manipulated by the politicians' efforts to instill needless fear, fewer wars would be fought and far fewer lives would be lost. Though the American people are fed up for a lot of legitimate reasons, almost all polls show the mess in Iraq leads the list of why the anger is so intense. Short wars with well-defined victories are tolerated by the American people, even when they are misled as to the reasons for the war. Wars entered into without a proper declaration tend to be politically motivated and not for national security reasons. These wars, by their very nature, are prolonged, costly, and usually require a new administration to finally end them. This certainly was true with the Korean and the Vietnam Wars. The lack of a quick military victory, the loss of life and limb, and the huge economic costs of lengthy wars precipitate anger. This is overwhelmingly true when the war propaganda that stirred up the illegitimate fears is exposed as a fraud. Most soon come to realize the promise of guns and butter is an illusion. They come to understand that inflation, a weak economy, and a prolonged war without real success are the reality. The anger over Iraq is faceted. Some are angry believing they were lied to in order to gain their support at the beginning. Others are angry that $1 billion we spent here on intelligence gathering failed to provide good information. Proponents of the war too often are unable to the truth. They become frustrated with the progress of the war and then turn on those wanting to change course, angrily denouncing them as unpatriotic and un-American. Those accused are quick to respond to the insulting charges made by those who want to fight on forever without regard to casualties. Proponents of the war do not hesitate to challenge the manhood of war critics, accusing them of wanting to cut and run. Some war supporters ducked military service themselves while others fought and died, only adding to the anger of those who have seen battle up close and now question our campaign in Iraq. When people see a $600 million embassy being built in Baghdad while funding for services here in the United States is hard to obtain, they become angry. They can't understand why the money is being spent, especially when they are told by our government that we have no intention of remaining permanently in Iraq. The bickering and anger will not soon subside, since victory in Iraq is not on the horizon and a change in policy is not likely to occur. The neoconservative instigators of the war are angry at everyone, at the people who want to get out of Iraq, and especially at those prosecuting the war for not bombing more aggressively, sending in more troops, and expanding the war into Iran. As our country becomes poorer due to the cost of the war, anger surely will escalate. Much of it will be justified. It seems bizarre that it's so unthinkable to change course if the current policy is failing. Our leaders are like a physician who makes a wrong diagnosis and prescribes the wrong medicine, but because of his ego can't tell the patient he's made a mistake. Instead, he hopes the patient will get better on his own. But instead of improving, the patient gets worse from the medication wrongly prescribed. This would be abhorrent behavior in medicine, but tragically, it is commonplace in politics. If the truth is admitted, it would appear that the lives lost and the money spent have been in vain. Instead, more casualties must be sustained to prove a false premise. What a tragedy if the truth is admitted. Imagine the anger of all the families that already have suffered such a burden. That burden is softened when the families and the wounded are told their great sacrifice was worthy and required to preserve our freedoms and our Constitution. But no one is allowed to ask the obvious. How have the 2,500 plus deaths and the 18,500 wounded made us more free? What in the world does Iraq have to do with protecting our civil liberties here at home? What national security threat prompted America's first preemptive war? How does our unilateral enforcement of UN resolutions enhance our freedoms? These questions aren't permitted. They are not politically correct. I agree that the truth hurts, and these questions are terribly hurtful to the families that have suffered so much. What a horrible thought it would be to find out the cause for which we fight is not quite so noble. I don't believe those who hide from the truth and refuse to face the reality of the war do so deliberately. The pain is too great. Deep down, psychologically, many are incapable of admitting such a costly and emotionally damaging error. They instead become even greater and more determined supporters of the failed policy. I would concede that there are some, though, especially the die-hard neoconservatives, who believe it is our moral duty to spread American goodness through force and remake the Middle East, who neither suffered regret nor are bothered by the casualties. They continue to argue for more war without remorse, as long as they themselves do not have to fight. Criticism is reserved for the wimps who want to cut and run. Due to the psychological need to persist with the failed policy, the war proponents must remain in denial of many facts staring them in the face. They refuse to accept that the real reason for our invasion and occupation of Iraq was not related to terrorism. They deny that our military is weaker as a consequence of this war. They won't admit that our invasion has served the interests of Osama bin Laden. They continue to blame our image problems around the world on a few bad apples. They won't admit that our invasion has served the interests of Iran's radical regime. The cost in lives lost and dollars spent is arrows up without concern. They ridicule those who point out that our relationship with our allies have been significantly damaged. We have provided a tremendous incentive for Russia and China and others like Iran to order through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They entertain future challenges to our plans to dominate Southeast Asia and the Middle East and all its oil.